All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome, come on in, grab a seat. Welcome to the second session of 2024 Acadia Science Symposium. I was just looking at my notes and I wrote on here, welcome to the second session of the 2025 Acadia Science Symposium. So, part of our work here is about the response to climate change. So we're very forward looking. So I'm already in 2025. As I mentioned, this is the second session. So the first one was just over a week ago, and that was put on by some of our early career fellows. And the title of that was What Drives Early Career Conservation Professionals? And it was wonderful, wonderful talks there by 6 early career folks who have either worked at Schoodic Institute, National Park Service, or with Friends of Acadia, and just talking about their paths and getting into conservation careers. So if you missed that, you can find a recording of it on the Schoodic Institute YouTube page. And so I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Nick Fisichella, President and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. So we are Acadia's primary science and education partner. And part of our role is to really foster the community of stewardship and science here in Acadia, to lead some of the science to inform stewardship in the park, to engage learners of all ages in the science and solutions, and also to tell the stories of stewardship, of science, of conservation happening here in Acadia and beyond. And this is work that really is done by a larger community and takes really strong partnerships. And really fortunate to be able to work with NPS staff here in Acadia and with Friends of Acadia and others on helping the park navigate rapid change. And I'm going to ask Kevin to come up here in a moment to introduce our speaker tonight. And we're really fortunate to have Ray Sauvajot with us, one of the associate directors of the National Park Service. It's not every week that we get an AD, an associate director, here at Schoodic Institute and in Acadia. But in fact, Kevin's been very busy this week with lots of VIPs, and not just one associate director, but 2 associate directors in the park. I think 1 regional director, 1 US senator, and some other VIPs as well. And normally when there's that many top brass coming to a park, it means the superintendent has done something very bad, and they had to call in the cleanup crew. But that is not the case here at all. Having all of these VIPs, I think, is a reflection of Kevin's leadership and just the really amazing work and strong partnerships here in Acadia. So please join me in welcoming Kevin.
Thanks, Nick. It's a real pleasure for me to get to introduce our speaker tonight, our keynote for the Science Symposium, Dr. Ray Sauvajot. Ray is the Associate Director for Natural Resources Stewardship and Science in our Washington office, which means he oversees the climate change response program. This is the most significant issue facing our national parks is climate change. And Ray is helping to usher in this new era of park management, of how do we manage national parks in the face of climate change. For many years in the National Park Service, we managed under sort of a static system, assuming that parks were going to be like they were at a certain time in history, and we were going to maintain that system. And Ray has really helped usher in a new way of thinking about our national parks in this country, from Acadia to Zion, from the Grand Tetons to Grand Canyon. And his background prepares him really well for this. He's been as the associate director since 2015 in Washington, so he's got a long track record there. But he also has been in parks. He was the chief of science and resource management at Santa Monica Mountains National Park, or National Recreation Area in California near Los Angeles. He also served as the regional chief scientist for the Pacific West region, the parks that encompass Hawaii to Nevada, Washington, down to California and the desert. And so Ray has a vast background that he's able to bring with us. And probably one of the things that I most value about Ray is his understanding and support of partnerships. Ray is a person who we have worked with closely through Schoodic Institute to help bring science fellows, for example, to Acadia National Park, to help make this research learning center all that it can possibly be, to help achieve the vision for this research learning center. And so he has been a tremendous supporter of Schoodic Institute and our partnerships here at Acadia National Park. So please join me in giving a really warm Acadia welcome to Dr. Ray Sauvajot.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was great. Yeah, so I am going to talk this evening about, on this eve of the symposium, you'll hear more about, or hear a lot more tomorrow about the critical role that partnerships and collaboration play in solving the challenges that face the National Park System and the National Park Service. And if I could, divulge my take-home message right now, the reason that is so important is because the issues that the National Park Service faces, the scientific issues that we face, as well as the solutions to those big challenges, big conservation challenges, big environmental challenges, and management challenges, cannot be done alone. They are dependent on working with others, and the complexity of the issues cannot be solved or understood without developing relationships with others. What I'm going to do is try to focus on that perspective of partnerships and collaboration through the lens of the areas that I'm responsible for in the National Park Service, and that's natural resource stewardship and science. And hopefully this will be an appropriate segue into the conversations and the discussions that will continue through the symposium. So I'm going to do this by starting with a description of what I would call a day in the life of a natural resource manager, a park manager, a park scientist, as they go through their day-to-day responsibilities and the kinds of things that they have to address, the kinds of work that they're required to do to get their job done. And my hope is that it will demonstrate that it's a really complex and challenging set of things that are, before these individuals. And I'll talk a bit about how we can maybe organize those challenges into a set of pillars of investment, what we have been calling a set of pillars of investment. Because often I get asked, well, why does the Park Service need resources for this? Why do we need funding for that? Why do we need positions to do this? Why do you need to develop relationships to get this kind of work done? And I always go back, and it helps to be able to point to sort of an organizing framework. And so I want to introduce you to that organizing framework. And then I want to talk more specifically about the challenges that occur, but also the opportunities to help address those challenges by going into some detail on 3 categories of examples. And these are sort of broad scale examples that every national park faces in some form or another. The first is going to be addressing visitor use and access. Who goes where? Who can go where? Why? What are the challenges associated with that? What is the role of the National Park Service? What is the role of science? What is the role of partners and partnerships and collaboration in addressing that? So I'll talk about that. Second, I'll talk about conservation at landscape scales and hopefully convince you that there is not a single issue that the National Park Service deals with that does not involve more than just the National Park Service. And then I'll talk about climate change, and we heard a bit already about climate change. And this is sort of the quintessential example of the importance of partnerships and collaboration. And then I'm going to conclude by inviting you all to be part of these partnerships and collaborative efforts in the Park Service. And the Schoodic Institute, of course, is a venue for doing exactly that. And so again, hopefully this will resonate. I will admit now that I intentionally selected examples that were less about Acadia. So I apologize for that. But I did that intentionally because I want to try to give you all the message that this is ubiquitous. These are issues that are cross-cutting across national parks, conservation challenges that occur at broad scales and that we need to work together to find solutions for. So we'll start with a day in the life. But first, we all know that our national parks conserve tremendous ecological diversity, tremendous natural resource values, and it's highly complex and highly diverse, many different kinds of ecosystems from low desert environments to, now dormant volcanoes to coral reef ecosystems to high mountains. And then within these places, of course, all these ecosystems harbor a huge amount of diversity, many types, including iconic places and species and environments that are representative of the natural heritage that in many ways create the identity of who we are as a people. So really, really important stuff in national parks. And the National Park Service has a responsibility to ensure that these values, these resources, these tremendously diverse systems are there for people to enjoy. And what's unique about the National Park Service mission that is a little different than other agencies and other land management groups, and certainly in the federal government, is that our responsibility to conserve those resources is explicit. It's explicit in the law that established the National Park Service. Basically says that the National Park Service is responsible for preserving these ecosystems intact and in ways that they will be available for people to enjoy in perpetuity. And so conservation is explicit, but also the expectation that parks are available for public enjoyment. They're for people, ultimately. And so therein lies the challenge, right? And there's multiple challenges embedded in this. How do we make sure that these values persist amid the responsibilities and expectations we have to make them available in perpetuity? And the language is actually used in the law that created the National Park Service says unimpaired. And so we have to keep things unimpaired. So you're working in a park, you're a resource manager, you get up, what do? What are the challenges that you're facing? And so in many parks, it may be addressing a number of day-to-day and site-specific challenges. Invasive species are a big problem in parks all across the country. The challenges of identifying what are the priorities to go after when you don't have sufficient resources to tackle everything. What is most important? How do you make those decisions? What techniques do you use? These are all things that are going to be going through your mind as you get up and contemplate your day in the park. Where are people going? Where should they be going? What kinds of impacts are being created by our obligation to provide enjoyment of resources while at the same time ensuring that they are unimpaired? And so I want to emphasize these again because these are things that are happening here and now, right there, when you get up and you go out in the park and you see these impacts, you see these challenges, you see these issues front and center. You may also have to deal with particular species or particular natural features that are very much in the public eye and for which your park may have been partly created to protect. And so maybe you're working in Joshua Tree National Park and you're obligated, concerned, and wondering how to ensure that Joshua trees are still there. They're still reproducing. They're still persisting in an environment that we know is changing. Or you are in Yellowstone National Park and you've got bison wandering around the boundary of the park. And maybe many of those bison, leave the park seasonally. And what do they do when they leave? And do they come back? And what are the kinds of things you need to do to ensure that those animals, those iconic animals, persist? Or you're managing sequoias, giant living things that exist in a national park, and wondering what does the future hold for a species like that. And the list goes on and on. I'll talk more about the right-hand side there, the forest birds of Hawaii. But these are iconic features. They're iconic species. They're things that parks were created to protect and for which you, as a resource manager, as a park manager, as a scientist, are entrusted to protect. On top of that, you may have damaged ecosystems that may have been inherited when the park was created, so things that occurred because of past actions. On the far left, Redwoods National Park in California, when the boundary was created, huge swaths of that park had been logged. And the idea was that these areas were suitable for redwoods, and so we'll put the park there, but someday the redwoods will come back. Well, what do you do about that? What are the investments necessary to get those ecosystems back to where they need to be? It may involve really ambitious restoration work that you may have underway. On the far right there, the removal of a dam in Olympic National Park that had been there for many, many years, but for which was preventing the migration of salmon that are a critical part of the ecosystem and so important to indigenous people that have lived in these areas for millennia. What does it take to get this ecosystem back to what it was? And what kinds of effort and work do you need to be thinking about and implementing to take that out and restore the ecosystem? And restoration isn't just limited to dealing with vegetation. Maybe ecosystems have been altered because particular critical species have been eliminated from them, like wolves. And so restoring damaged ecosystems or incomplete ecosystems may include reintroducing species. And sometimes those reintroductions may involve species that may have complicated public perceptions like wolves. And so this becomes your responsibility to figure out what to do and how to do it. And all of these issues, all of these concerns, so as you get up and you do your work, you have to think about these in a lens of change, that there is no, as we heard, there is no going back. You have to look forward and understand that the ecosystems that we are entrusted to protect are inherently dynamic, and they are also being affected by changes, many of which are well beyond your control, but will have definite impacts on the decisions you make and the actions you take. And so I point to the far left there, sea turtles that may be nesting in the Gulf Coast parks of the United States spend only a very small portion of their lives in the national park, but it's a really important time when they go up, lay eggs and nest, but then they're out in the ocean again. How are you to help ensure that that resource is going to be available into the future when its dependence, as highlighted with those sort of lime green trajectories of movement, depend on so much more than is within your direct responsibility? In the middle panel photos, understanding people's perceptions and their values and their expectations when they come to parks. And how are those expectations changing? And how are they affecting your work, your ability to actually implement successful resource stewardship projects? It depends on understanding those perspectives. You have the responsibility to discern them and to apply them in your work. And then we've, again, heard about and will continue to hear about climate change. On the far right, I'll just point to an example, and I mentioned those Joshua trees. What do you do when higher fire frequency that is facilitated by the introduction of non-native grasses means that more fires more frequently come through ecosystems where they never came before because of the interaction between a changing climate, long dry spells, non-native species that are flashy fuel for fires, prevent this iconic species from reproducing in the park. Your responsibility, what do you do? And of course, these kinds of challenges aren't limited to that ecosystem. This is occurring across the country in a lot of different places. And so the point here is that as you get up and start your day, there's a myriad of challenges that you need to face. And those challenges occur at scales and over time frames that are very dependent on others and are very dependent on relationships in order to find solutions and to understand directions to go. So amid all of those issues and challenges, to try to put this into a framework that hopefully puts some organization around it, we have developed 4 pillars that we use to describe the complexity of these challenges when we are working to pursue support and investment and understanding of the work that scientists and resource managers and park managers do with respect to the natural environments in national parks. And I'm going to just touch on these quickly. The idea around these is to be able to provide an organizing framework that helps to explain or provide a rationale for the complexity and the diversity of issues and challenges that we address and the kinds of needs that we have. So first up there is holding the line. There's a lot of work that we do on a day-to-day basis that requires actions here and now. I mentioned some of those earlier. But at the same time, all of the actions that you take have to consider that the environments that you're responsible to protect are changing. Of course, right front and center is climate change, but there are other kinds of changes that are occurring too. So managing amid continuous change. Also recognizing that the decisions you make are going to be dependent on the decisions that others make at broader scales. And so your work must be leveraged at broader scales. And then finally, we need to invest in ensuring that the work that scientists do, that resource stewardship practitioners are involved with, that people have the tools that they need to do their work. They have the tools that they need to make sure that they can develop the partnerships and the relationships necessary, and that that information is accessible and promotes engagement. And that may be accessible to park managers, accessible to other agencies. It also points to the need to have this information understood and available to the public so that they have an understanding of why we do what we do. And so that's another important area of investment. So partnerships and collaboration are necessary for you in your job as a national park manager, resource steward, park scientist. These are necessary for you to have success in your work. And I talked a bit about, again, this organizing framework around the site-specific investments needed to protect, mitigate, respond, and restore ecosystems. The response to change that includes climate change, but may include social changes and understanding the social environment within which parks occur. The investments we need to make in inventory and monitoring resources to track those changes. Conserving at scale, so landscape scale conservation and ocean stewardship all occurring at broad scales. And then finally, as I mentioned before, facilitating science and supporting our workforce to get the good work done, giving them the tools they need to enhance their partnership and collaborative work, connecting science to decision makers, connecting science with other kinds of knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, so that that information can help inform the decisions that you have to make as a resource manager. Okay, the theme And indeed, the work of the Schoodic Institute is heavily focused on the importance of partnerships and working together and collaborating. And I want to just illustrate that concept by describing some, true to life challenges that national parks are facing right now. And I mentioned before, they're going to be in these three categories. So, visitor use and access. Of course, parks are for people, right? Our mission obligates us to make sure that that people can enjoy parks. And I'm sure that many of you have seen images like this before. So the question I ask for you is, how many, what kinds of use, where? Who makes that decision and how is that decision made? It depends on understanding what people's expectations are and coupling that to an understanding of the outcomes and consequences of different kinds of access in different places. So those can be informed by science, right? Science can help us get to the bottom of these questions, but at the end of the day, it requires a lot of collaboration, partnership, cooperation, and communication about why decisions are made in order for us to achieve the mission of the National Park Service. None of these are easy challenges. It depends on looking at how different kinds of uses in different places and different amounts of use affect the resources. And so investing in the science that's necessary to do that. Understanding who visits parks, when and how and where and what people do when they go there. So investing in social science and developing an understanding of who these user groups are and using that to help guide the decisions around visitor use and where people go and what they do when they come to parks, and doing that collaboratively with others so that the solutions that are developed are supported and understood, but also realistic. And I'm going to talk about a specific example because it is, for better or worse, near and dear to my heart, about something that's a little unusual maybe, although I did notice that the airport over here advertised specifically this. And I bring this up because the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration are currently the subject of litigation, a lawsuit. And the lawsuit was that the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration was not properly regulating air tours over national parks, and air tours like airplanes and helicopters. So scenic tours. And I'll talk about a little bit of the complexity. And so the National Park Service has jurisdiction on the ground, but the minute you get off the ground, it's a different federal agency, the Federal Aviation Administration. And so there's no way that we, the National Park Service, can make decisions about whether this is an appropriate use or how this use can occur without collaborating directly with another agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, which has a very different mission. This is a hugely popular activity. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of flights every year over the Grand Canyon at the top there. And then it's also very popular in Hawaii, particularly to view volcanic activity, but many other parks. Lawsuit, National Park Service, working with the FAA, you need to put a plan in place for 24 parks where this is a big deal. And you need to do it in a year initially, but that got extended to a couple years. We're in the midst of that now. I apologize, put this up, the little cartoon. It says, no, we're not near an airport, we're near a national park. What do you do? How do you address this issue from a scientific perspective, from a management perspective? Well, this has depended on the National Park Service with our partner, the FAA, putting together a comprehensive analytical framework that has used sound monitoring information and an understanding of what's on the ground that may be affected by different kinds of uses with aircraft and helicopters, and to use that information to inform a plan that would direct these kinds of activities to areas that have the least potential for impact, and at times and in ways and at altitudes that will minimize these effects. But that work depends on science. It depends on understanding these effects. It depends on sophisticated analytical tools. And that work has been underway for the last couple of years. We worked with a technical organization through the Department of Transportation called the Volpe Center to put these plans together in parks all across the country. But it's not just about the noise on the ground. It's also about the experience that people have when they visit parks and what their perceptions are. We have that responsibility too. And it also is dependent on the value of these iconic places to people, particularly people that have called these parks home for millennia, indigenous people, tribal organizations that are very concerned about how these kinds of uses may affect their experiences and their relationship to these places. And so they're very complicated challenges, but the solutions depend on working across boundaries and working with others and developing relationships. Okay, shifting to landscape scale challenges. Many of you probably heard the phrase, no park is an island, right? Well, that's definitely the case. The far left map just shows the distribution of various kinds of public lands and the sort of fragmented nature of that. So for a number of years now, the National Park Service has recognized that the values for which national parks were created cannot persist without understanding the relationship of those values, of those resources, with the surrounding landscape within which they're situated. And a sort of vivid example of that, this is the Yellowstone ecosystem on the right side. Each one of those colors represents an elk herd, a different elk herd. And then you can see the boundary of Yellowstone National Park is that green area. And you'll see that the elk that hang out a lot in Yellowstone National Park only spend a portion of their time in Yellowstone National Park. So these animals are moving in and out. There's no way that these populations, these seasonally migratory populations, are going to persist in the park if there aren't relationships and conservation efforts that involve partners at broader scales. I'm going to go to Yellowstone again and tell you that very precise and high impact science is underway, because it turns out that this is not a unique phenomenon, as we can all probably expect, but that ecological processes and species move around. They do not look at the boundaries of parks as their indicators of where they should be or not be. And species and processes travel great distances. There's mule deer in the middle, the purple lines. Again, this is the Yellowstone ecosystem that's kind of on the left and in the center. These populations are moving in and out every year, and they travel great distance across amazingly complicated landscapes, crossing rivers and going over mountain passes. And it's not limited to that species. It occurs with moose, and everything that you look at, you discover that this connectivity occurs at broad scales, and it depends on research to elucidate the dependence of the resources for which the parks were created, the science necessary to understand those relationships, but then the application of that information toward solutions that help ensure that these values persist over time. Those depend on partnerships. Those depend on collaboration. I know I talked to some folks at dinner about my personal connection to mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains, where I worked for 16 years. There was a time when it was sort of a mythical creature. Did it exist or not exist? And we set up a array of camera traps, and were able to confirm that yes, indeed, This iconic animal still does exist in Southern California, but the protected parklands that are sort of shown in the different shades of green there are small relative to the home range sizes of mountain lions. And so each one of those different colors represents a home range of a mountain lion. This is from a few years ago. They've done a lot of work subsequent to that that continues to demonstrate this pattern. And so you see that the number of mountain lions you can stuff into these areas is very small. It is below the level for which a population can persist over the long term in any single one of these areas. And so if you expect this animal to persist over time, it will depend on its ability to move over the broader landscape, which will depend on the ability of land managers to help address the challenges and obstacles that they may find in their pathways. And in Southern California, and for a big, wide-ranging animal like this, a big source of mortality, which science also has helped demonstrate, is from getting killed on roads. So what are the solutions? Well, years ago, we envisioned the idea of figuring out ways to get animals across, some of the busiest roadways in the entire world by, contemplating crazy things like that. A giant bridge for wildlife over the 101 freeway connecting the Simi Hills to the Santa Monica Mountains. But compelling information, good science, and people's interest and value in protecting the resources of parks, and the participation and collaboration of many agencies has meant that this is now, as we speak today, becoming a reality. And so that concept is now turning into an actual wildlife overcrossing, again, over one of the busiest roadways in the entire world, to help ensure that the ecosystem remains connected. A huge amount of participation from many agencies and organizations to both collect the information, with universities participating, some of the earliest work from UCLA on this, and then the participation of non-governmental organizations and foundations to help provide funding, the transportation organization in California, Caltrans, and the image on the right there, Governor Gavin Newsom, if you don't recognize him, is the second there from the left. Groundbreaking on this about a year and a half ago. Maybe it was a little bit more than that. You can see it now if you go to LA. It is under construction. Science making a difference, but only making a difference if that work is done in partnership and collaboration with others and is available to decision makers to help move the needle in conservation actions. Okay, we've all heard about it. Climate change. One of the most significant, if not the most significant, overarching challenges that national parks face are the changes that we now see are occurring as a consequence of a changing climate. The far left map shows the likelihood of biome shift, ecosystem changes across the country as a consequence, or across the continent as a consequence of climate change. And you can see, like, the red colors are significant changes are anticipated. And, interestingly, Acadia sits right in the middle of the red, I think, up there. So big changes are afoot. Many of those changes we're experiencing now. This has important ecological consequences. So looking back, I just point to an example from California on the right there, the alpine chipmunk that was surveyed in the 1920s and 1930s through scientists working at UC Berkeley who did surveys of plants and animals all across the West, have very meticulously recorded what was where, when, and by looking at those records and comparing to surveys that have been conducted now, have been able to demonstrate that the species that were there then are not there now. And the most significant determinant of their distribution is a changing climate. This was like super new news not too long ago, but Now you're probably all thinking, yeah, we've already heard this story. It's becoming very, very apparent and clear. And so that alpine chipmunk is one example of one of the species where it is no longer in areas in Yosemite National Park that it used to occur because the habitat has changed sufficiently that it is now forced to higher and higher elevations. Oh, and I should mention quickly, it's not just about resources, natural resource values, but climate change has huge implications for the facilities and infrastructure that is important for people to help them visit parks in ways that are environmentally sensitive. We're losing roads. This is Yellowstone last year. The barrier island parks along the eastern coast are experiencing increasingly strong storms. Storm surge that's happening right now as we speak. Huge challenges that will impact parks, will impact the facilities and the infrastructure and the historic resources, and will necessitate tough decisions using good information with partnerships and collaboration. I want to talk a little bit about another little unusual example that's, again, happening right now. In Hawaii, there are, first of all, Hawaii, tremendously ecologically diverse, lots of endemic species that are only found there, nowhere else in the world. They've evolved in the unique environments on these islands. Hawaiian forest birds, of which there's a wide variety of different species that have diversified on the islands. If you look on the left map or island image with a little ship in it, so imagine people coming ashore in Hawaii, and upon their arrival, bringing with them mosquitoes that were not native to Hawaii. And those mosquitoes carry malaria, avian malaria in particular. And the birds that are on the island had never experienced this disease. And the mosquitoes actually bite the birds by right around their eye, and they can transmit the malaria to the bird, which causes the bird to die. But for many, many years, the mosquitoes were depressed to the lower, or they could only persist in the lower elevations because they were sensitive to the colder environments that occurred at higher elevations. And so the consequence was that these species became quite endangered, but they still persisted because there were these places, these refugia that allowed them to persist at high elevation forests in Hawaii. With the changing climate, those mosquitoes are able to move up higher in elevation. Consequently, the threat to these birds disappearing forever is increasing, and in fact is a very realistic prospect for several of these species now. What do you do about that? What is the solution? Is there a solution? Well, maybe there's a solution. It turns out that through the work of innovative and collaborative scientific undertakings, there is a bacterium, Wolbachia, that you can infect mosquitoes with, which renders them unable to reproduce. They can, and this is with males, and so you can infect males, and when they reproduce with a female, there are no offspring successfully produced. And so what if you get a bunch of male mosquitoes and you infect them in a lab with this bacteria, and you release them so that they essentially swamp out the other male mosquitoes such that the reproducing female mosquitoes produce fewer and fewer offspring, so that you can depress the population below a threshold at which the birds can persist. Now, this is some pretty crazy science. Will it work? The experiment is underway right now in Haleakala National Park. It is underway ultimately in other national parks and in other parts of Hawaii. And again, the theme that I want to come back to again is that this work depends on partnerships in science, collaboration, innovation that depends on different groups working together, and ultimately applying that information on the ground in parks with multiple agencies coming together, multiple organizations, and the public to support these kinds of investments, these kinds of efforts. Partnerships, collaboration, critical. Giant sequoias, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, these trees have persisted. They persisted through all kinds of various environmental changes and droughts and fires until recently. The last few years, and I'm sure we all read about them, the wildfires that occur out west, and particularly in areas where sequoia groves occur, are happening at an intensity never before seen, because the plants, the trees that are in these communities are experiencing longer, drier summers with drier conditions driven by climate change that facilitate these intense fires that, when they burn, actually kill giant sequoias. Never before happening. And this is happening in a significant amount of places in Sequoia National Park and in other places where these sequoia groves grow. Monitoring information over many years has demonstrated this, and a scientific understanding of the challenges and the adaptations that these trees have demonstrated that a combination of factors associated with climate change has resulted in these fires. These groves, under the conditions that we're facing now, will not persist unless something happens. What do you do? And so again, the solutions depend on working across broad scales, coming to agreement on what are the mechanisms and the actions that need to be taken to help ensure that we can depress the intensity of fires in these critical groves, in a sense attempting to mitigate some of the climate change effects, and in some cases taking even more proactive action for iconic individual trees that are especially important for park visitors, for national park values, and literally protecting them from fire when the fire event is occurring. And so these are actions that are underway now through broad scale efforts. Many agencies and organizations depends on good science, collaboration, and working together to implement solutions. With respect to climate change, that science is critical for the National Park Service. It is informing our direction on climate change response. The Park Service now is investing in a large amount of vulnerability assessments in parks all across the country, translating that vulnerability into planning and design and resource stewardship actions, using a framework that calls on us to potentially accept the changes that are occurring, or potentially resist the changes that are occurring, or to use our skills as resource stewards to direct those efforts. And I promised that I wasn't going to talk that much about Acadia, but I did have to put up your sign. Resist, accept, and direct. Acadia is changing, so are we. The future is unclear, but we know enough to implement actions that will help us successfully achieve the conservation mission that the National Park Service has. So, wrapping up, achieving the National Park Service mission depends on embracing partnerships and collaboration. The challenges that the National Park Service faces from a natural resource perspective are complex, they're wide-ranging. We cannot do it alone. And we don't typically have the expertise or the capacity within the Park Service to fully understand the breadth and depth of these issues. And so we need partnerships like the Schoodic Institute facilitates to get that information. And we need tools to ensure that that information is made available so that when the solutions are developed, that we have the partnerships in place to help implement them. And they're all beyond the scope of any individual park. I'll just touch on some of those tools. The National Park Service works with a whole network of universities through our Cooperative Ecosystem Study Units network. The network covers all different parts of the country with partnerships and agreements and sort of administrative processes in place that invite scientists to help us understand what's going on in parks. Research learning centers like the Schoodic Institute is exactly that effort where not only the inviting of doing science in parks, but also the relationship between people and their understanding and their participation in science, so making science part of the park experience. So facilitating the translation of science to managers, but also inviting people to be part of the engagement in science in national parks through research learning centers. Implementing other tools and efforts, utilizing opportunities to expand our relationships. I'll point to tribal co-stewardship. Again, drawing from the perspectives and knowledge of indigenous people to help understand and manage parks in the face of the challenges that we have now. I'm going to point to the lower right there, the reintroduction of the California condor into redwoods national and state parks, a project completely and totally intertwined with and a collaborative effort with the Yurok tribe. Citizen science activities where the public actually becomes part of our effort to understand resources in parks. And I'm going to put a nod up to partnerships that extend beyond agencies and jurisdictions and government organizations to foundations. We work in the Park Service at the national level very closely with the National Park Foundation, and there are many other organizations that we work with as well on that. So investing in science together, identifying the challenges and those priorities, and working together to amass the partnerships that are necessary to get this critical work done. So hopefully these examples have been interesting or insightful, but have demonstrated that for us to do our work successfully, we need to be working together at broad scales across long time periods to understand the challenges and to find solutions to them. And I would invite you all to engage in exactly that yourselves and point to the Schoodic Institute as a venue for doing that. So I will wrap up. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions if people have questions.
Thank you very much, Ray. While folks are thinking about questions, I'll ask one here. So people in different professions have different reward structures, and that's certainly true of scientists and managers. So how do you foster co-production of science and management?
So many of we can talk about the esoteric questions that scientists like to answer, but many of those questions can help science better understand the world and how it operates. And so the key is to merge the the goals and objectives of what managers need and what scientists need. Scientists need to answer these big, important questions. But many times, the process that they go through to help answer those big, important questions and the information that they gather while doing that has direct implication for solutions on the ground by managers. And so, the sweet spot is bringing those things together. I think that things like research learning centers provide a great venue for that, helping to identify what the challenges are on the ground that managers face, helping to turn those into scientific queries, scientific questions that scientists themselves want to answer because it is part of their responsibility, their job to help understand the world better. And so there's actually a lot of room for that relationship to develop. So we have shared values, shared goals, and the key is to bring those things together, to be inviting to people to learn about the challenges, but use that in a way that helps managers have that information available to inform their decisions as well. It can be a win-win. There aren't a lot of those out there, but this can be.
Other questions here in the audience?
Hi, my name is Joanne. I work for the sister organization, Friends of Acadia, and I work in development. So how can I be the middle person? What's some great tips I'm not boots on the ground. I'm not doing the science.
Yeah.
How do I relate these stories to my donors?
Yep.
So that it's not overwhelming and feels doable?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. I would say that and I think both messages can be compelling. So there are big challenges: making national parks resilient to climate change, responding to these challenges. But we can do those things in bite-sized pieces. And those bite-sized pieces can be very compelling so that a donor can look on the ground and say, hey, I helped the park make this meadow more resilient, or this wetland more resilient to the effects of climate change. I can see that on the ground, but that wasn't all you did. You contributed to the broader strategic goal of positioning national parks to be better prepared for the effects of climate change. And so this balance between aligning strategic priorities, these big, gnarly challenges that we're facing, which can be implemented at various scales and in different places where you can show real results that matter. And maybe that individual project isn't going to solve the broader challenge, but it's an important contributor to it. And so I would encourage people, as you're working with donors or people, to talk about the importance of the steps that can be taken at a local level, but the relationship of those local steps to broader goals, and know that those things are happening in other places too. And so your contribution, your participation, your donation is actually doing much more than simply helping to, restore this wetland. And we in the Park Service and other organizations would be happy to help tell those stories and provide that information so that you can be effective communicator with the people that you work with on that. Or entities like Schoodic Institute, I think, are great venues for helping to connect those stories.
Collaborators with us as well. So.
A question from a participant on Zoom. 25 years ago, the term public-private partnerships was heard often in national political conversations. Congress seemed to value such partnerships when it came to funding bills. Now the term is rarely uttered. Is the fiscal environment in Congress and the administration a hurdle for advancing this kind of work, or do you see good prospects for funding this work in the future?
I guess I would answer that in two ways. Public-private partnerships can be thought of in the perspective of actually funding projects. So similar to the question that we just talked about. I think that there is interest in private philanthropic support for the kinds of things that we were talking about. Most, I don't want to say all unless I look a little more carefully, but nearly every single project that I described there had a significant contribution of private dollars. In fact, that largest wildlife overcrossing in the world is privately funded. And so that is an incredible indicator of the interest. But I think that that interest needs to be coupled with people feeling like their contribution is significant and relevant, right? It is part of a bigger whole. And so I'm optimistic about that. In our own relationship with the National Park Foundation, that organization has expanded its fundraising capability a lot, including for natural resource stewardship and science kinds of projects. I think in part because there is an interest in people feeling like people that are interested in donating, that they're part of something bigger, and that we can articulate that effectively. So that's the funding side. The other side of public-private partnerships is the implementation of actual projects on the ground. And I showed you the images of the wildlife moving in and out of Yellowstone. A lot of that happens on private lands. It happens on ranch lands. It happens in areas where there isn't, the solution is not going to rest on the decisions that a government agency makes. It's going to depend on the actions that private landowners undertake. And in those situations, I think that what the information can often demonstrate is, because I think there's a lot of shared values out there, right? When you go to Yellowstone, or when you're in that ecosystem and you live there, you actually value a lot of those things. There may be disagreements about the specifics about how one manages wolves or how one deals with elk. But in general, the perspective of ensuring that these ecosystems are persisting is largely shared. The devil is sort of in the details of how that happens. And so if we can use good information to help point to solutions that are reliable and that provide a path forward that help achieve those shared values, then I think that we have a much greater chance of turning public-private partnerships into solutions to conservation challenges. And we're seeing that now with like connectivity, habitat connectivity in areas where there are roads that impact everything from turtles and salamanders to mountain lions and moose from getting across roads. The willingness of people to invest the dollars necessary to help undo some of that. Removal of fences, which is not a huge impact if done properly to ranching communities, but can have huge benefits to something like pronghorn out in the West. So I think that the key is to be able to come to common ground in shared values, to use information to help craft solutions that, again, help us together achieve those common goals. There's always going to be situations where, those details are going to be messy and there will be controversial issues. But I think that we have more in common around these conservation goals. And what we can do with public-private partnerships is together find solutions that depend on the knowledge that we have about what works. So hopefully that's, can't see who asked that question, but yeah.
I was going to ask a very similar question, including using that same terminology. I think one of the great challenges for institutions and versus philanthropists, or institutions versus institutions, is they often have very different time frames. They have different abilities to commit beyond a year and so forth. The government is notoriously difficult to collaborate with, precisely because they often have rigid rules. Philanthropists are happy to collaborate, but sometimes they want their names on buildings, things of that sort.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, I do want to congratulate you on how much progress is being made. And I totally agree that there's lots of potential opportunities. But, a question will be, but administrations change and, you talked about a lot of things that maybe in a previous administration would have been hard to use the same language. Those kinds of things drive you crazy. And so my question is there any thought being given to some kind of more flexible structure that's maybe quasi-governmental too, in terms of how you think about managing certain elements and how when you are rigid and when you can be a little more flexible, and also how can you do some multi-year commitments at times where that's multi-year unless the next guy doesn't like it.
Yeah. Next question.
Yeah.
No, I mean, those are really good points. And I would honestly say that what I see a big part of my job is to help navigate those challenges. I know that when I came into this position in Washington, D.C., it was unlike anything I'd ever really done before, just in terms of the complexity and the expectations and responsibility. And honestly, the contention around issues. And it has been likened to me that, it's like working for a very large corporation where they toss the CEO and change the board of directors every 4 years. And, how to navigate that. So I am a career National Park Service employee. And as I jokingly say to my close friends, of which you all are now, I'm on the B team. We be here when they get there, and we be here when they leave. And that happens in a cycle, right? But what we try to do is through that, and what I would sort of endeavor to try to do is to identify those challenges, those obstacles, and work to find ways to streamline or eliminate, if possible, some of those obstacles, but also to align the work that we're doing with the mission of the agencies and organizations. These are public responsibilities that we have been given, and those don't change between administrations. The way in which these things get implemented and the different kinds of priorities that may get advanced may change. They may change a lot, but to find the opportunities to utilize what those interests are to still advance the ultimate mission of the organization. And it's a fine line. There's no question that it is. But again, back to what are the shared values and the mission? I can always fall back on that and say, this is an obligation. Congress, the American people speaking through Congress said, this is what you need to do. So we need to find a way to get this work done. Also, to be opportunistic and and to not take the complexity of any of this personally, right? And this is now you're just hearing me like talking to myself. These are challenges that we face every day, but the outcomes are worth it. And preparing ourselves for the different opportunities and the different priorities, but to try to use those always in a longer term goal that we're trying to achieve. And so, yeah, there's obstacles along the way. Let's work to get rid of those. Priorities may shift, but we still have an obligation. So yeah, it is a constant effort. But the outcome is worth it. And there are examples of success. And then we need to use those and grow from them, I guess. I don't know. That was a really arm-waving example. That was more of a personal psychoanalysis, I think. Yeah, I've been in interesting conversations in the past decade or more where that, and a lot of the decisions, and we touched on this today when I was out with people that, and I talked a lot tonight about science. And science is really helpful to help guide where we want to go and to help inform the decisions we make. But so much of these kinds of decisions around conservation are driven by what people are interested in. It's public, these are public values as well. I mean, the National Park Service and the national parks are created because people wanted them, and people have expectations about what they should represent. And in order to meet those expectations, we need to understand what's going on in parks and how they change and what's affecting them and what could cause them to, change in different ways. So we need science. And we need to use that information to make management decisions. And I think coming from that perspective, it's not, I think that everyone, needs to not go here anymore because I don't want people trampling these sensitive habitats or whatever. That coming at that from a perspective of, we collectively have identified these places as important and valuable, and our understanding of them has indicated that if we don't take these actions, that it would jeopardize those values. Coming at it from that angle, I think, is better than immediately setting yourselves up for a conflict. So if we share the values, yeah, there's plenty of nuance in there. It's why the jobs are interesting, right? For all of you aspiring, it's really cool stuff, but oh my God.
Hi, I'm Chris Mons from Utah State University. I've done many years of research on visitor use management and interpretation. I really enjoyed your presentation. One thing I've been very passionate about over the years is the role of parks as a vehicle for interpreting climate change and for instilling an ethic in the broader public to really induce some of the societal level changes that we really have to do. The management interventions are part of the solution, but are only part of it. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about what you see as the role for parks in the future as that vehicle for broader societal level change, that we really need to think about the parks as that interpretive center for getting the information about climate change out and having folks take that home with them.
Yep. No, that's an excellent question, because, at the end of the day, what the National Park Service does will not solve climate change, right? We as an agency could become completely, carbon neutral, and we could be sequestering carbon and all of these things. But at the end of the day, the actions that need to be taken are well beyond what is available to the National Park Service as an agency. But what the National Park Service does have, and the responsibility that we do have, is to showcase these places that people value. And we can help people understand what they're seeing and experiencing, whether it's the complicated history of America when you're at a Civil War battle site, or the environmental changes that we demonstrate can show because of climate change, right? And so it doesn't force you into, again, a complicated or potentially contentious conversation. You are interpreting, you are describing what people are experiencing. You may be describing why we are taking certain actions based on information. And the reason that we're taking these actions is because the evidence, the data, the information is telling us, is showing us that these changes are occurring. And don't believe me, look right there. Take that information home. These are values that we all share. These are challenges that we're all facing. There are ways that all of us can contribute in our own way to helping to address some of the causes of these concerns and challenges. And so I think that the parks have a role to play in helping to provide a window to the understanding of these effects in a way that resonate with people. They're visiting, they're coming to see these things because they value them. They wouldn't be there otherwise. And to use that as an opportunity to help make more real, more visceral the effects that are occurring and how individual actions can at least partly mitigate those effects. And so, yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. And the Park Service is pursuing that. They are pursuing that. And our own actions, even though I said, you know, we're not going to solve the climate crisis because we're going to become carbon neutral, but there are things that we can do in our own activities in parks that can demonstrate some of the potential actions and solutions that people can embrace, whether it's transportation systems that are carbon friendly, or building designs that rely on renewable energy sources, or investments in facilities that make them more resilient to climate change. So people can see there is a path.
Great, appreciate all of the questions here. Just mindful of time as well. I think we'll do one more from Zoom and then one more in the room to wrap up. Ray, is the pace of science keeping up with the challenges you face? And what would you change about research to make it more translatable to solutions?
Yeah. I think that the pace of science, I mean, I think we have tremendous scientific capability in general, right? Scientists do good work. The key is to make that science accessible and relevant. And that work doesn't always happen most effectively by the scientists themselves. And so I think there's a really important role for translators, if you want to call it that help to identify how a challenge can be informed by science and how scientists can better articulate the implications or the relevance of their work to solving management decisions. That is a skill set that may not be as effectively sitting in the hands of the manager or in the hands of the scientist. And so I think that the role of communication is really important, and that people that can speak both languages are really, really valuable. Sometimes they may speak one better than the other, but that their mindset is, how do I get this information accessible and available? I think that Skudik Institute is a place where that can happen. And we need to keep investing in those kinds of efforts. I think that the pace of science and the information that is available and that is being generated is extremely helpful and adequate, but not as often as it could be available and accessible. And so to me, that's the bigger challenge. Not the pace of science, but rather the accessibility and relevance of it.
Okay, my name is Caroline, and I'm a PhD student. So I'm kind of in this moment of my life where I went to school like because I like science, I like conservation, I like ecology. And now there's this moment of like, do you go the path of working for agency, of being a researcher? Or, there's decisions being made and for other early career folks in the room too, I'm sure. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on maybe how your path could inform us or what might be out there for us right now.
So full disclosure, I fully anticipated that as I was completing my PhD, that I would be sequestering myself in a university somewhere. Always interested in applied work, so I thought that that would always be something that I was interested in. But I was the expectation was that was the proper career direction. That got upended when there was an opportunity with the Park Service to try to walk this line of continuing to do science, or at least my kids many years ago said, "Daddy, you're not a real scientist anymore, are you?" True story. Uh, um, but for me, there was still a huge amount of satisfaction having that scientific background to be able to apply that in ways that help to solve management problems. That said, I felt like, and I continue to feel like, I'm super dependent on those that are sitting in universities doing a lot of the basic research, because we rely on the work that they are doing to extract that information in ways that help us make better decisions. And so I think there is a role for both. I will tell you that the pressure and those that were very interested in pushing PhD students to academic careers now, and fairly soon after I left the academic environment and started to work for an agency, would call me back and say, can you please come and talk to our students, because many of them are interested in going down more applied routes, and we would like you to talk to them and share your experiences and tell them it's okay, that's a good route. And to me, that was an indication of success, that this is a very it's a rewarding path. But I think it sort of depends on the personality and what drives you. But it's critical that we have both, and I am grateful for that. But I have to say, because I'm whatever, all of the people that are looking toward public agency careers and that may be in public agencies now, I look at my friends, of which I have many that sit in universities, and I both long for those days and also point out to them, you guys got it good, because you can do all this really cool science and you can say all kinds of stuff and about how important it is, but you don't have to make the decisions. The people that are there doing the work that is relevant to the decision making, that's the tough work, because it is the stuff that opens up the values that people have, and it demonstrates the differing perspectives and how you use this information to make policy decisions. That's really tough. It takes, I think, a lot of effort, but it is so rewarding because it matters. So people that are contemplating that route, I would absolutely encourage you to take it. It's tough, but it makes a difference.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. That's a great question to end our evening. Well, thank you, Ray, so much. One more time, round of applause for Ray. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow for our day-long symposium.